Joe Rogan, Jordan Peterson at it again. In this one, I'm glad you're with me. It gets interesting, that's for sure. So let's get into it.
How
That's
does
the
how
suit
does one
story,
wrestle
man.
with God? Do you wrestle with God?
With every word. So what does that mean? Well, look, man. Well, here. Part of the reason that you're so successful, in my opinion, is because you actually say what you think. Like, you're not putting on a show. Actually, you have no reason to put on a show. You put on a whole bunch of shows, and they've already been successful. When you're actually asking the questions that are genuine questions, and people can trust you because of that. And that means that you're letting the words emerge as they come to you. And doing that with each word, that's a decision, because you can use your language to manipulate, and you can use your language for your own, say, hedonistic purposes or to gain power. Or you can just say what you think. All of those different choices are a decision. That's a wrestling. That's a moral decision. And it shines in every word. And so it's super important. That's part of the reason why in the Christian canon, the word is the basis of reality, right? It's the process that generates the order that's good out of possibility and chaos, right? And so and Israel, the word Israel means we who wrestle with God. So that's the chosen people, right? And so what that means at a deeper level even is that if you're genuinely wrestling with your conscience, then you're someone who's chosen by God. And I think that's right. That's accurate.
It's interesting what you just said. One of Terence McKenna's lectures, he talked about a very profound psychedelic experience that he had where he was given this revelation that the world is made out of words, that everything is made out of words. Like he had just some sort of a profound understanding of what words really mean.
Well, how much of the reality that surrounds you has been, what would you say, has emerged out of the realm of possibility because of what you've said? A lot. And you've had this huge influence on the world. That's all a consequence, almost all a consequence of what you've said. And so there's an insistence in the Judeo-Christian canon that that the capacity that words have to shape possibility is akin or identical to the process that generates reality itself. And I think that's true. That's why in the opening chapters of Genesis we're described as formulated in the image of God. We're like a microcosm of the process that gives rise to order itself. It's a very different view than the bottom-up materialistic view, let's say, of the Enlightenment in the scientific world. It's a different way of looking at things.
All really good sort of foundational themes to build on. I am going to pause it here just to there's a lot to sort of unpack, and we're going to go through it kind of fast. And so I don't want to get lost. I don't want some of this to get lost because they're going to build on these ideas. I think there's sort of an Athens and Jerusalem theme here, which is in Athens, the logos that created all things. It's sort of left in the realm of a philosophical idea to some degree. Now, I think Socrates pushed it to the embodied word, but we'll get to that as this conversation unfolds. Now, the sort of the Hebrew concept is that God came into human history, and there's sort of a personal aspect of that. Though God is infinite and sort of unknowable, the only way we can truly know God then is if God comes into our life and reveals himself to us. And so I tend to think Jordan lives in one area of this and overlooks the other, but we're close. And so do we wrestle with God? Why is Joe Rogan's podcast important? I've talked about this in other podcast, but he is a mixed martial artist. So he has embodied this idea of wrestling, and he is a good conversationalist. He participates in the dialogue, and I think that is why his podcast is really popular. And I think that's why podcasting, when done well, is really popular, because it's giving us an opportunity to participate in the dialogue, this dialogos, this way of sort of wrestling through our own beliefs and our own ideas, but ultimately bringing us to a point of contact. I think that's the end goal of the process. Now, Jordan Peterson, he's gonna kind of lay out some more of his worldview here, and he's gonna say something very similar, But I want to hear from you if you pick up on the same thing that I do, that there's something missing. It's a great worldview, but I still feel like there's something missing in what he's about to present to us. But you let me know too.
It's the notion that what is in front of you is a field of indeterminate possibility. It's got some implicit structure, as the scientists insist, but it's open, and you grapple with it like you grapple with your dawning consciousness in the morning. What confronts you in the morning is a field of possibility, and you approach that with a certain kind of orientation, and you use your words and your linguistic capacity to think to shape that possibility. And if you do that properly, then you make, this is the Genesis 1 insistence again, you make the order that's good or very good, and that depends on your orientation. So in the Sermon on the Mount, for example, which is an instruction manual, Christ tells his listeners how to orient themselves in the world properly. So he says, first, aim with all your heart at the highest good you can imagine. Now, you'll get better at that as your vision clears, but that's the orientation, to do what's right. Now, you might say, like Pontius Pilate said, well, what is right, what is truth? But most people know the difference between right and wrong. So you orient yourself to the highest possible upward place. Then you make the assumption that other people have the same intrinsic value that you do. So that's your initial aim and presumption. And then you pay attention to the moment. And that's often the statement that gets Christ confused with the hippies, to consider the lilies of the field who don't toil or spin. But that's not the instruction. The instruction is to aim up with everything. And then, having that firmly in mind, to pay attention, as much attention as you can, to each moment, to allow the words to come to you that best suit that upward aim, not to subordinate your language to your own machinations or manipulations or your own hedonistic desire, but towards what's right. And if you do that, then what emerges out of possibility is akin to the garden, to the original garden in Genesis 1, and it's the order that's good. Truthful language brings about the order that's good. That's a very accurate way of portraying the role consciousness plays in bringing about reality. So, and it's not that viewpoint, by the way, isn't limited to the Judeo-Christian canon. You see the same thing in the Taoist representation, because in the Taoist world, you have a domain of order is the white serpent, and the domain of chaos or possibility is the black serpent in the Taoist image, the two snakes, head to tail. And your job is to walk the line between them. And you can tell when you're walking that line because that's where things are maximally meaningful. And so that's another element of this vision, which is that if you orient yourself with upward aim and you straddle the line between order and chaos, then things become maximally meaningful around you.
Okay, so in this clip where Jordan is really sort of giving us the structure of his worldview, at least that's the impression that I get. He's sort of walking us through this new book, We Who Wrestle With God. Very familiar with, I went to his Nashville We Who Wrestle With God presentation, and so this is sort of a little bit of review here. And again, I'm picking up on a lot of sort of Greek philosophy here, right? So Socrates would tell us that we need to orientate ourselves to the greatest possible good, that which is true, good, and beautiful. And Jordan Peterson touches on the true, touches on the good, and eventually they do get beauty makes an appearance. They get to beauty eventually when they're looking at the sculpture of Mary and Jesus. And they talk about the beauty of this sculpture. So beauty sort of finds a way into the conversation. But here he's telling us that we need to attend to that which is most meaningful or the highest possible good. And again, is that just an idea, a philosophical idea like the logos that's impersonal? And I think if it is that, if it's just the impersonal sort of logos, the word, then the project will collapse in on itself. These philosophical sort of structure that Jordan is presenting to us will collapse in on itself, right? And again, I speak from a Christian worldview here, and so I think of Jesus as the capstone, right? He's the stone that brings the whole structure together. He is the Word incarnate. And I guess what I'm hearing from Jordan Peterson is he's really like wanting to attend to the Word, but for him, it's not the incarnate Word. So let me know. That's where I'm asking you to participate in this dialogue. So we're together participating in Joe and Jordan's dialogue. We've sort of created this second tier, and then I'm going to ask you to engage in this on like a third tier level. And I think to the point of why podcasting is important is I do think we're in a cultural moment where we are engaging in dialogue in a way that is very unique for us in this present moment. I think it's awesome. That's why I continue to do it. But to the point of that philosophical project, let's say, collapsing, you notice it because Jordan pushes himself all the way to this sort of the pinnacle of his structure. He starts to bring in the Sermon on the Mount. I think he sort of misses what the Sermon on the Mount is really about. But then he goes into Taoism. And to me, that seems like we've collapsed down into the particulars. So again, I'm pulling from some Greek philosophers. Plato would have emphasized the universal idea. Aristotle would have sort of brought us back down to the particulars. And as I'm listening to Jordan Peterson do this, I'm like, oh, he's pointing us to the pinnacle. And if it's just an idea, okay, then boom, what's this other idea? Oh, it's in Taoism. So we see the idea represented in Taoism. So we sort of collapse the whole Christian motif down, and then we start to build from Taoism. But of course, Taoism and Christianity, I don't know that they're that conversant with one another. So you're starting to build off of a rocky foundation there. And to the point of the Sermon on the Mount, what is Jesus actually telling us? Is he telling us just to aim up? Is he saying just aim at that which is, the highest possible good? Or is he giving us something else? He's shaping our world view around the kingdom of heaven and around the fact that this world and the kingdom of heaven are sort of upside down, opposed to each other. Blessed are the poor in spirit. These are not people like Jordan would claim later on who sort of strap it all onto their shoulders and start marching up the hill. They've been humbled. Those who mourn, those who are gentle. This view that Jesus is giving us of his kingdom begins with a heart that is humbly submitted to the person of God. I think that is not a point to be overlooked. It's important to sort of make that distinction between the idea, the logos, and the person who is Christ, who is the embodied word, the incarnate word. Luke Thompson pointed this out in his live stream. There's actually today talking about personal knowing. Paul writes about Christ. He says, I want to know Christ, the power of his resurrection, and the fellowship of sharing in his sufferings. It's not Gnostic. It's not knowing ideas. It's familial knowledge. It's the knowledge of someone that you live in community with, that you live in relationship with, that you live in communion with. That's the type of knowing that the Bible is encouraging us to have. Not just, it is philosophical. It can be very powerful philosophy, but it pushes beyond that. And I think that's an important point. So now I do want to get to this next part because we've sort of heard from Jordan Peterson and his philosophy, and we're going to begin to hear from Joe Rogan and some of his philosophy. And I think what's interesting about both of these is that they both acknowledge the need for real transformation, that we need to be made new. They're going to point to different ways in which we're made new. And so
we have this wrestling match going on in our culture, let's say, between the nihilists and the atheists and the true believers, you might say. And one of the faults of that war is that no one stops to elucidate or delineate exactly what it is that we're arguing about. So you have people like Dawkins, they parody the traditional conceptions of God, a superstitious being, nothing more than a defense against death, anxiety, or the opiate of the masses, the old man in the sky. The conceptualization of God in the Old Testament and the New Testament is unbelievably sophisticated. And to reduce it to that kind of parody is a stunning disservice.
Dawkins is an odd duck. He's an odd duck because I think he knows also that there is some value in psychedelic experiences, but he's scared to have them. And
He won't look through Galileo's telescope. you
yeah,
mean.
but he's had major health crises, right? Didn't he have some sort of a stroke or something like that?
I don't know. I don't know.
He did. I believe he did. I believe he had a major health crisis. It's like, how much time do you have left? Like, what are you gonna do? You gonna just not try it forever? You're just gonna dismiss everything forever? And I feel like people that dismiss things like that, this reductionist perspective, you're essentially saying you have the answers. And to dismiss the whole question of God or of whatever you want to call it, higher power, a creator of the universe itself as a conscious entity, whatever it is, to dismiss it just because you're trying to decipher the writings of fairly comparatively unsophisticated people, because we're talking about people from many, many thousands of years ago without access to the information we have today. And then you're also dealing with the fact that many of these stories were of an oral tradition for over 1,000 years before they were ever written down. So to just dismiss that as superstition and silliness without any curiosity about the root of these things, why they resonate with people, and to just say that this is superstitious nonsense that people choose to believe in this reductionist perspective of the known reality that we currently exist in. It's a foolish way of interfacing with something, and it's shocking when a obviously brilliant man has a foolish way of interfacing with a very complex situation.
Well, it's especially odd in his case because he's also the formulator of the idea of meme. And
Right.
like a religious story is a meme that's been selected by time and crowd. That's a good way of thinking about it.
So the wrestling match that's going on in culture between the nihilists, the atheists, and the true believers seems to have taken on sort of global scale. If we're keeping with the idea of where does podcasting fit in this? I think that has helped us achieve this sort of global scale to the point that we're seeing what's going on in Richard Dawkins' life right now, and this idea that the religious stories are memes is a fascinating one. To Joe Rogan's point, why do these stories resonate with people? And we've talked about this in the past, but those things which don't have the strength to endure the test of time, the pressure that society will put on them, those stories or those ideas will eventually crumble under the weight of that. And so what's happening is this process where the community is selecting those stories, and time is selecting those. So to Jordan's point, time, and he says the crowd, but I would prefer to use community, and because there's a common unity, right? There's a quest for truth and knowing in the way we spoke about it earlier. And so I think that is fascinating because there's another way of even looking at this for, I guess, for definition's sake, with regards to Dawkins and the meme, an idea, behavior, style that spreads by means of imitation from person to person. That, I think, is a very important point within culture, often a series of symbolic meanings representing a particular phenomenon or theme. A meme acts as a unit for carrying cultural ideas, symbols, or practices that can be transmitted from one mind to the other through writing, speech, gesture, rituals, or other imitatable phenomenon with a mimicked theme. And so, we see this in nature. This is how kids learn to talk. This is how they learn to use their hands. They see it happening. The word meme itself is a Neologism, new word. Okay, so logos, you see that, logism, new. So it's this new word coined by Richard Dawkins, originating in 1976 book, The Selfish Gene. Dawkins' own position is somewhat ambiguous, but he welcomed N.K. Humphrey's suggestion that memes should be considered as living structures, not just metaphorically. The living word, the logos, the word made flesh. And this is a deeply biblical idea that we become what we behold. So to Jordan Peterson's earlier point, what are you using to orientate yourself through life? What are you looking at? What are you attending to? And from the biblical perspective, the encouragement or the admonition or with the revelation is you have to attend to Christ, the Word made flesh. And when you do that, when you can see him, you become like him. This is 1 John 2:3. All right, I got it wrong. 1 John 3:2. 1:3:2. Beloved, we are children of God, and it has not yet appeared as yet what we will be. We know that when he appears, we will be like him, transformation, because we see him just as he is. So seeing him just as he is a transformative experience. If the thing that we're attending to is the person of Christ, true transformation is possible. If the thing we're attending to is like Christ but isn't, then the whole thing collapses. A living structure, the living stones that Christ uses to build the church, he himself is the capstone, living. But he's also infinite, so he can hold the whole thing together. I just think if you don't have the person, I'm getting a little preachy here, we do want to listen to Joe Rogan's we do want to listen to Joe Rogan's philosophy here in a second, or his worldview here in a second. But yeah, again, I hear that and I go, gosh, we're so close.
Can I tell you a story?
Sure.
Okay. It's a good story for the psychedelic experience, perhaps, at least as an analog. So in the story of Exodus, there's a number of circumstances under which Moses has an encounter with God. And they're very useful stories to understand because they point you to how that can make itself manifest in your own life. You don't get to pick what interests you. It picks you. And you can respond to that call and investigate or reject it. Those are your options. And if you reject it, you stay in your box. But if you follow it, something will call to you. And then if you investigate that, that will transform you. And if you investigate it deeply enough, it'll transform you into the person who can stand up against tyranny and who can lead his people away from slavery. And that's how God is defined in that story. God is the thing that calls to you to take you out of your role, that will shape the manner in which your psyche transforms itself as a consequence of your diligent investigation into what calls to you. And so that's the God that's portrayed. That's one image of the God that's portrayed in the Old Testament.
Are you aware of some of the more recent work that's been done by scholars in Israel, where these guys have now come up with this hypothesis that the burning bush was actually, it was a DMT experience, and that the burning bush was most likely an acacia tree, that the acacia tree is apparently rich with DMT, and they think, the way you get a DMT experience is you smoke it, right? And that they had some method of achieving psychedelic states through this, and this is where Moses is encountering God.
I know about the theorizing, and it's certainly the case that people have been using psychedelic experiences for we don't know how long.
Right.
Hundreds of thousands of years, no doubt. And they've had a profound cultural consequence.
Have you read any of Marco Allegro stuff?
No.
John Marco Allegro wrote a book called The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross.
Oh, yes. Yeah. I read that back. Oh, my God. I read that a long, long time ago. I had no idea what to make of it. When I read it, I thought, I have no idea what to do with this.
It's a problem because to really understand what he's saying, you'd have to have a deep understanding of those ancient languages.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it's a very difficult book to evaluate.
Because there's very few people that are even qualified.
So why is it that psychedelic use has played the role that it's played in your interests and your pursuit of knowledge? What do you think it's done for you that that's being valuable?
I think we're in a weird place in society where the term drug is a blanket, and it covers things that have vastly different effects. There's a million of them. They're all different, and they're all drugs. And the idea that psychedelics are a drug, for lack of a better term, that's what we use. I don't think that's what they are at all. I think they are probably why we became people. I think they are probably why society advanced. And I think every great ancient culture probably celebrated them and used them.
Okay, so in sort of classic Joe Rogan fashion, we get into the realm of psychedelics, and there is it possible that psychedelics can explain how we have the biblical text? I've said this before in other podcasts. I don't think it has explanatory power. I don't think that psychedelics can explain the human experience of encountering God, because if we're in a box and psychedelics are part of this created world that's in the box, they might be able to help as a medicine, help people with PTSD. We've talked about that. But because they're in the created world and we're in the created world, because we're both in the box, the psychedelic, the substance cannot get you knowledge outside the box. It can't assist you in ascending to the next sort of level in that hierarchy of beings. And so, to the point earlier, God has to descend into our realm of being. And so this is kind of the glimpse into Joe Rogan's philosophy. He really does lean into psychedelics. He's talked in the past about how, potentially apes evolving came into contact with psychedelics through mushrooms and sort of allowed them to envision how to make tools, and then society evolves from there. Again, I feel like it doesn't have explanatory scope. It doesn't really explain the reality that's in front of us. It certainly doesn't help us grapple with sort of the existential stuff, the problem of evil, it seems like suffering is a necessary element in this world. It seems like there's just more going on that we cannot explain if we are trying to explain it from the physical world alone. So I thought it was also interesting that they both talked about these transformative experiences. I mean, Jordan is talking about Moses encountering the burning bush, which is how Joe gets onto the psychedelics. But then Joe is talking about psychedelics and their transformative effect. I do think there is certainly experiences are transformative. They're powerful to transform us, but are they powerful enough to free us, let's say, in sort of this biblical concept of the things that really limit us, imprison us, keep us a slave to sort of, again, from the biblical concept, sin. I don't know how you explain the world in front of us without going into the nature of sin and evil. I just don't. Maybe that's my Christian bias. If you've got another way of explaining it, let me know. But ultimately, that's kind of the wall that I come up against. Is these are great philosophies and things like that, but it doesn't help me deal with my sin problem, the evil that I'm aware of that seems to reside in me. I need a rescuer. I don't need a thing to rescue me. I don't need an idea to rescue me. I need a person to rescue me. And to Jordan's point earlier about walking the golden mean in Taoism between order and chaos. Again, pulling from sort of the Greek philosophy, Aristotle would say, well, yeah, we have to walk the golden mean between virtue and vice. And when you really start to unpack what that means, you realize that no human being can do that. No person has ever done that except for the God-man, Christ. And then he invites us into himself, which is a profound mystery. And so we are able to participate with Christ. It's not us doing it on our own. but they will begin to explore that piece more deeply. It's sort of like two halves to this conversation. Jordan kind of sets his philosophy. Joe kind of gives us a little bit of his philosophy. And then they'll go into this really beautiful conversation about the person of Christ. And I don't think that's an accident.
Okay, so there's an emergent idea in that story of adventure-led transformation that with every profound transformation of character, something that's not appropriate has to be let go of. That's why, by the way, that's why Abraham's story culminates in the sacrifice of his son. Because the sacrifices get higher in value as the developmental progression upward continues. And that's basically the story of individual development, right? Follow the call of adventure, aim upward, continually remind yourself of your fundamental goal, and then let go of everything that isn't appropriate as you transform forward. So Abraham ends up with a new name because of doing that. That's how different he becomes in the course of his adventure. It's like Jacob. Jacob becomes Israel, and Abram becomes Abraham, because the consequence of him following the pathway of adventure, the calling, is a transformation that's so complete it's as if he's a different person. And that, those stories are maps of that transformative process. So they culminate in the Christian view of things with the ultimate sacrificial offering. So that's the idea that lurks in the New Testament, is that the ultimate in transformation is brought about by your willingness to put absolutely everything on the line, no matter what. Right. And that's a very different view of the religious enterprise than something like defense against death anxiety. Right. It's the ultimate adventure, and that's the willingness to welcome everything about life that's terrible and painful and malevolent, to welcome that with open arms, to accept that. And that's predicated on a deeper idea even, which is that sacrifice is the basis of community, which is exactly right. Because you have to give up something to be in relationship to the future and other people.
Right.
Right. So the biblical corpus is an examination of, what would you say, levels of sacrifice moving downward to the ultimate possible level of sacrifice. So in the Abrahamic story, Abraham is requested by God to offer up his son. Right. Now he gets him back. The threat isn't carried through. And what does that mean? It means, first of all, that everything in your life, no matter what it is, including your relationships, should be made subservient to the highest possible aim. It also means that a good father sacrifices his children to what's highest. That's the offering of your child to the world, the faithful offering of your child to the world.
So real quick, and I do hope that this is helpful. I'm sort of breaking this up into bite-sized, digestible chunks here. And I just wanted to sort of, I don't know if correct is the right word, but I do feel like sometimes when Jordan goes through these Bible stories, it can become confusing because, at least for me, and again, you tell me what you think, he seems to be missing the point that would bring the whole thing together. That Abraham is not transformed because he responded to the call to adventure. That's maybe part of the story, but Abraham is transformed because he enters into the presence of God. That's the transformative experience, and that's why sacrifice is at the center of the Christian message, not because the idea of sacrifice is so powerful, though it is. It's because it was embodied in the person of Christ, and Christ is at the center. And again, I think if we miss that, then kind of the threads start to come unraveled. But I do think, to Jordan's point, this is it's amazing, because it makes sense of the world biologically, psychologically, philosophically, you live it out, and it makes sense. And it does call you to adventure. It does call you to a transformative experience. But again, just sort of ultimately anchored in the person of Christ, coming into contact with a person. That's what Abraham experienced. That's what, Jesus is embodying sacrifice. So when we as Christians think of sacrifice, we think of Christ, not the idea of sacrifice, and not just like begrudgingly thinking, okay, so I should live my life out of sacrifice. It's like, no, I see what he has done for me, and then I need to live my life as he lived. That's the mimetic transformation, not just the meme idea that Dawkins was pointing out, but the mimic, mimetic. We mimic him, and because we're watching him, we're looking at him.
It's a famous statue of Mary in St. Peter's in Rome. Michelangelo made it when he was like 23, some ridiculous early age. Brilliant statue. Mary is holding the body of her son, broken, in her arms, looking serene. He's an adult, off the cross. It's like the female crucifixion. And the idea is that the good mother, the proper father, offers their children to be broken by the world in the pursuit of what's highest.
There it is.
Yeah.
He was 23 when he made that? That is insane. Oh, God,
What were you doing when you were 23?
telling shitty jokes.
Single block of marble. To get your child back, you offer them to the world. That's a profound indication of faith, right? That life is worthwhile despite its suffering and its evil.
And it's so good.
Well, also so inspiring, you know.
So inspiring. But stunning. Like stunning how good it is.
Yes, and stunning what it means and where it's placed. God offers Abraham the opportunity to be the father of nations. Okay, so imagine this as a father. So we use father as a generic word, right? Everybody has a father. So there's a generic aspect to it. There's a role that you play if you're a father. And then you could imagine there's a role you could play as a good father. Okay, so that's what Abraham plays out. He plays out that archetypal role. And the idea there, and this is why I made reference earlier to the idea of the selfish gene. Dawkins characterized human reproduction as selfish. That's wrong, because the human reproductive pattern is multi-generational. And if you want to establish the pattern of fatherhood that's going to cascade down the generations, that will make your descendants successful in the multi-generational manner, then you follow the spirit of adventure and you imbue your children with that confidence. And that's how that pattern that establishes the dynasty, so Abraham is the father of nations, is established. So human reproduction is way more complex than just sex, far more complex. It's a multi-generational commitment. So now the promise that God makes to Abraham, in part, is that if you fall into that pattern of maximal adventure and courageous movement forward, that your life is imbued with the meaning that transcends time, and that you embody something like an archetypal and eternal spirit. And that's the spirit of the Father. That's why Abraham understands that he's made contact with the God of his ancestors. And if you're a good father, you have that spirit dwelling within you. And the Christian insistence is that that spirit's identical to the logos that bears the weight of the world on its shoulders voluntarily. And that's what brings everything into being. Stunning. It's a stunning conceptualization. And I think it's right. It looks right to me. And the idea that sacrifice is the basis of the community, that's just obvious.
Here, I think Jordan gets to the point, and I don't even know if he is doing this on purpose or if it's something that's emerging out of the dialogue, but he does say that the spirit of the Father and the spirit, the Logos, are one, which of course would be very biblical idea that the God of Scripture, the God of the Bible, is a Trinity, Father, Son, and Spirit, and that it is the good Father who's willing to sacrifice his Son. It's also the Son who is willing to go and be the sacrifice. And so it is a harmony within the Godhead, within this Trinitarian view of God. And again, I noticed that, and I wanted to highlight it because, again, I don't know if he's doing that on purpose or if it emerged, but ultimately, again, pointing us to Christ incarnate, sacrificing himself in humble submission to the Father, but ultimately in union with the Father's plan, as we ought to also embody. And as we go into this next clip, I do want to point out that Jordan uses marriage as an example of that sacrifice. And again, on purpose, accident, part of the dialogue that, it emerges out of the dialogue is, this is also just a very biblical example of Christ and the church, marriage, the sacrificial element of love, unconditional love that was displayed by the bridegroom, who is Christ, that we need to live out in our marriages. So again, maybe coincidence, but I think not.
The fact that you're married. So what's the sacrificial gesture there? Well, all other women. That's sacrifice number one. Then it's not about you. It's also not about your wife. It's about the stability of your union across time. And it's about the stability of that union insofar as that's a reliable foundation for your children. So that's sacrificial too. You give up your whims in the present so that the future's stabilized. You give up your immaturity so that your children can thrive. That's all sacrificial gesture. And we figured that out. That's why we put the crucifix at the center of our society. Because we figured out, even though we didn't know it, we figured out that the stability of the community is predicated on the willingness of the individual to sacrifice. And the exploration in the New Testament is the limits of sacrifice, right?
So do you think that that's what people think of when they think of the cross?
It's very hard to think about. It's very hard to know what people think about. I would say it depends on
Because
their level of sophistication.
Right, that's what I'm
Right,
getting at.
yeah.
I don't think it's ever been explained to me that way, and I don't think most people think about it that way when they think about it. They think Jesus died for our
Yeah.
sins. There he is. Praise Jesus.
Right.
It's a very
Formulaic.
formulaic,
Yeah.
surface level understanding
Well, I
of
think
what
it's
it is we're
partly
talking
because the full revelation of the significance, let's say, of the imitation of Christ, which is supposed to be the foundation of Christian belief, is in fact the demand that you walk the same pathway.
This is one of those places where they get so close, and yet if you think that the story, the reality of Jesus dying for your sins is a surface level understanding, then you don't know Jesus or his death or the nature of sin. And I get what they're doing. You know, they are in this sort of this dialogue has carried them into the realm of philosophy, and Jordan does have a really good way of finding new language, let's say, so that the story of Christ isn't this sort of repeated and kind of generic. I wouldn't call it surface level, but sort of like the generic way that kind of the modern Western church portrays the person of Christ. I think that that's more what Joe is touching on when he says that it's sort of this shallow representation, is that we don't pause to really unpack the person of Christ, what it means that we are the bride of Christ, what it means that he has sacrificed himself for us, and what he sacrificed to free us from. I think we have a pretty small view of sin. I think we have a pretty small view of Jesus' sacrifice. And I think we have a small view of the person of Christ. And so I get what they're saying, and I understand that that's probably what Joe is touching on. But this is C.S. Lewis, and he'll help us sort of unpack this idea from Ephesians. Husbands, love your wives. Love your wives, just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. Unconditional love seen in self-sacrifice. C.S. Lewis writes this: the husband is the head of the wife, just insofar as he is to her what Christ is to the church. Read on. And gave his life for her. So not just the head, but a self-sacrificial, loving husband. His headship then is most fully embodied, not in the husbands we should all wish to be, but in him whose marriage is most like a crucifixion, whose wife receives the most and gives the least, is most unworthy of him, is in her own mere nature least lovable. That's us. For the church has not beauty but what the bridegroom gives her. He does not find, but makes her lovely because of his sacrifice. And I'll include this whole quote in the description of the video. But again, I hear that. I hear that in Joe and Jordan, and I'm like, I enjoy this conversation, but at the same time, I'm sitting here going, okay, we're real close. And yet, if we stop short at the knowledge of the person of Christ, and again, not just gnosis, not just head knowledge or some sort of philosophical knowledge, but a familiar, a communal friendship. I don't call you servants any longer, but I call you friends. Greater love has no man than this, that he would lay down his life for his friends. That is the knowing of Christ that we're trying to get to here. I agree with Joe and Jordan that this is part of a conversation that's going on more broadly. You could bring in Dawkins, you could bring in this sort of nihilism and the atheism and the true believers, and we could have this conversation. But I do feel, and maybe this is too critical or harsh of Jordan Peterson, I don't know that he's the man for the job when it comes to unpacking what's truly going on in the biblical worldview, in the biblical Christian worldview. I do appreciate him refashioning it into words that will bridge the gap between people who have maybe felt like they've heard the church story before and it was lame, and so they dismissed it. G.K. Chesterton says, it's not that Christianity was tried and found wanting. It was found difficult and left untried. And I think that we as a church need to do a better job of displaying the gospel and sharing the gospel. And I think we could learn a little bit from Jordan Peterson in that way. And in fact, I think that's what this next clip kind of brings us to, is some of the stuff that I think that I've learned from Jordan Peterson, even though as a public theologian, I still sort of go, I'm with you there, and then you didn't really arrive. You didn't really bring me to a destination, or in my idea, a person that can really help me with what's really going on.
So the first thing that makes a tragedy tragic is that the tragedy befalls a good person. Because if a tragedy befalls a villain, it's just justice. It's not a tragedy. So it has to be a good person. So then to amplify that, you would not only have the tragedy befall a good person, you'd have it befall a good person that everyone knew was good, but was not only good, was the best, and that was persecuted because he was good. And then you might say, well, what does he have to face? Well, and the answer would be, well, the worst life has to offer. Okay, early death, early painful death, early painful, humiliating, unjust death at the hands of his friends, at the hands of the mob, under the thumb of a tyrant, brought about by people who knew that he was not only good, but the best of men. That's an archetypal tragedy. And then it doesn't limit out. So then you have the death that occurs in consequence of that, and it's voluntary acceptance. But that's not where it ends, because the mythology surrounding the crucifixion story insists that Christ harrowed hell after the crucifixion, which meant that he confronted not only death, but malevolence itself, and in consequence transcended both. And so what's the underlying psychological message? It's something like the calling and the voice of conscience informing people that in order to thrive properly in life and to become who you could be, you have to voluntarily take on the weight of the worst life has to offer, including the depths of malevolence itself. And you think, well, obviously, Joe, you know this. Like, how are you going to adapt to a situation you won't even admit to? Well, so how could it be otherwise than for you to become everything that you could be, you have to embrace all of the catastrophes that life has to offer? Like, how could it be other than that? You're going to hide? You're going to pretend?
Right.
How's that going to work? No one thinks that'll work.
Right.
And so, and you're right, there is this defensive element to particularly the Protestant religious tradition, although I don't want to single out the Protestants specifically, that insists that, the work has already been done. But there's a lot of ambivalence about that in the Christian canon, because there's an equal insistence that you're supposed to take all this on voluntarily. And that not only that, it's such an interesting idea because it makes so much sense psychologically. So imagine that as your courage grows so that you can confront more and more of the horror of life, that a spirit begins to develop within you that gives you a strength that's commensurate with your daring. That's walking with God. That's the same thing. So the promise is that if you had the courage, something would be with you to allow you to bear up nobly under the burden. All the clinical evidence supports that proclamation, because what you see in people in the therapeutic transformation is that insofar as they're willing to confront what terrifies them voluntarily, they get stronger. And then imagine that there's nothing but a metaphysical limit to that. And I think that's right. I can't see how it cannot be right.
It makes sense, and it resonates with how we know people that have overcome great things in their life and become these very unusual and unique people.
Yeah.
So if you go back and listen to Jordan essentially tell the gospel story of Jesus' sacrifice, his death and resurrection, I love that he says that it doesn't end there. It doesn't end with the sacrifice. Jesus goes to hell and conquers hell and death itself. And I mean, I think that is wonderful. It's interesting for me that then he takes the story and says, well, what's sort of the underlying sort of psychological application? I don't know if he's saying it exactly this way, but what's the application in my life? What am I supposed to do with that story? And sometimes I'm not sure that that's a helpful question. I know we do that a lot in church. We want to know, like, what's the takeaway? What's the application? What do I do with this? And I think sometimes you let the story develop. You let the story sort of, you ruminate on the story, and you just stay with the story for a while. And then it does transform you, I think, because of this mysterious nature of Christ, that he is the Word made flesh. And it's not just the ideas, it's not just the words that are transforming you, but that there's a person there. And so I find it fascinating, and I would be curious to know what you all think. I am a Protestant. I look at this, that's sort of my tribe, if you will. Although as I do this podcast, I begin to see the church in a new light, and so I'd be curious to know what you guys that are in the same sort of tribe, I guess. Maybe that's a bad word, but if you are also not Orthodox or Catholic, but are a Protestant Christian, do you agree with his assessment of the Protestant church that there has been this idea that, well, it's the finished work of Christ, it's done? Because we as Protestants are very skeptical of anything that sounds like a works-based doctrine, that your salvation has anything to do with what you do. But there are texts that say, work out your salvation with fear and trembling. There is a response, and I think about it more from, my response was when I came into contact with Christ. I saw that he laid down his life for me. Unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains alone, but if it dies, it bears much fruit. I saw that. And then I thought, well, what's my response? Well, my response is to do the same. How do I give my life over to Christ? He who loves his life will lose it, and he who hates his life in this world will keep it for eternal life. Anyone who serves me must follow me, and where I am, there my servant will be also. If anyone serves me, the Father will honor him. That's communion. I am with you. I am there. The Father will honor him, the Father and the Son. That was my response, was I saw what Christ had done, and then I thought this was interesting to Jordan's point. No temptation is overtaking you except for that which is common to man, but God is faithful. Sorry, these are... He will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able, but with the temptation will provide a way out, a way of escape also, so that you will be able to endure it. And some translations say stand up under it, So there is a load in a sense, but it's not something that crushes you. My burden is light, Christ says, that his freedom that he gives you is the freedom to stand up under the temptation of the world, the trials of the world, the pain, the suffering of the world. And back to this, I think to Joe's point here at the end, there is the ability, I think, with Christ to have this sort of post-traumatic growth. Dan Allender works this out in his approach, which would be a really interesting conversation because Jordan is a psychologist and Dan Allender is one as well, but he very much approaches this from a biblical Christian worldview, that there is post-traumatic growth of a profound kind when it comes to giving our pain over to Christ. Dan Allender says, don't waste your pain. Give it to God and see what God does with it. And so there is this transformation. That's been one of the themes of this conversation, or at least the clips that I have pulled out for the purpose of this dialogue. Thank you for being here with me. I think we have said quite a bit. Hopefully stuff to chew on, because again, I said this before playing this last clip, that there are some things that Jordan does challenge me in my own thinking about this. I think his approach here at the end is a little bit more Catholic and a little bit more Orthodox than my approach to my own faith, and yet within that I can see that there are areas that I need to learn. I am not a person who practices spiritual disciplines well. And there are times in my life that I've been convicted of that, and I need to be a person who practices those better. And so what might be sort of the takeaway for you? That's kind of my takeaway. There's the takeaway. But other than that, I hope that this dialogue will just sort of resonate with you, and that we can carry it with us throughout the week. The next podcast that Joe Rogan did with this I thought was really interesting is from a guy named Alan Graham, and he actually has a podcast called The Gospel Concarne, the gospel incarnate. And so here we have Jordan Peterson, who sort of sets kind of the philosophical framework, and then the immediate podcast following is Alan Graham, who works with homeless and downtrodden people, who is embodying the gospel the way I think Christ would have, going to the least of these, going to the people who are marginalized, overlooked, and helping them find home. I think that is such a beautiful piece of the gospel that we should embody. So I thought that was really interesting that the two podcasts actually work as, in a way, sort of like a dialogue or an opponent processing. So I will do that. I will break that podcast down as well, and I'll catch you in the next one, which is that one that I just talked about. And clearly I've done enough talking. See you.